Welcome, viewers and listeners, to this episode of the Deadly Analysis Podcast. Today, we've put together a monster mashup, a science fiction double feature, if you will, to dive in and explore the quest for secret and forbidden knowledge. Yes, there is a light over at the Frankenstein place, but I'm not talking about the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Tonight, we will be reviewing the 1931 horror masterpiece Frankenstein, and we will be pairing it like a fine Côte de Nuit Burgundy and a big greasy Philly cheesesteak with Mel Brooks' 1974 classic, Young Frankenstein. Now, if you've been a fan of the show for any length of time, you'll know that this isn't our standard methodology. The vast majority of our roundtable discussions focus on a single film, except for a few instances where we do a direct comparison between an original film and its newer remake. However, in this particular case, there is a unique relationship between Frankenstein and Young Frankenstein that warrants discussion above and beyond what you might uncover when talking about either of them separately. Frankenstein, directed by James Whale and featuring an iconic performance by the legendary Boris Karloff, is loosely based on a book by the same name by Mary Shelley, which was published in 1818. The film focuses on the story of Henry Frankenstein, an obsessed scientist who has all but abandoned his friends, family, and fiancée Elizabeth in pursuit of his mysterious experiments. Eventually, Henry's friend Victor goes to visit him along with Elizabeth and one of Henry's old professors, but reluctantly, Henry allows him to come into his lab where he reveals that he has built a human body that he believes he can bring back to life using a frequency of radiation above ultraviolet. Truly the Bruce Banner of his time. Henry's experiments turn out to be successful. However, his creation is non-verbal with an extreme fear of fire and violent tendencies, presumably because his assistant Fritz brings back an abnormal brain to be placed into the body before it's reanimated. It's clear through Karloff's performance that this reanimated being is experiencing existential distress. He's begging for identity and guidance, and it is taught through the reactions of the people around it that it is a monster. The monster escapes the lab and accidentally kills a child, and because of this, the villagers chase it into a windmill where it attacks Henry, but is eventually, presumably, burned to death. Now, of course, there are some sequels and so on and so forth, but that's not really relevant for this version of the film. The reason that Young Frankenstein, though, is such a perfect foil for this is because Frederick Frankenstein, Henry's descendant, seems cursed to follow in Henry's footsteps. There's a notably heavy-handed emphasis on destiny throughout Young Frankenstein, and the story is nearly identical, but at the end we get a complete subversion of the story in the 1931 film, and in Young Frankenstein, Frederick is able to save the monster by taking personal, moral responsibility for his creation and sacrifice half of his own brain to turn the monster into a fully functioning person. Now, I absolutely love this because the resolution here makes for what I see as the major thematic flaws and shortcomings of Frankenstein, and I can't wait to talk about why that is. But before I do, I want to go ahead and hand it over to my co-hosts, Jim and Shara, who for their not for their final thoughts, but for their initial thoughts on the two films and the overarching tale of the Frankenstein family. So, what do you guys think? Initial thoughts on Frankenstein or Young Frankenstein or the overarching story? What do we got?
Well, I've actually always kind of disliked the Frankenstein story. I think it's a product of its time in a lot of ways, but as the story reads, it's relatively anti-science, right? Even in the beginning of the 1931 version, we get this character who sort of comes out on a stage, which we could talk about why that fits within the film traditions of the time. But nevertheless, a character comes out on the stage and basically says, this is a story about a man who has defied God and as a result, presumably would meet his end as a result of quote unquote defying God. And it sort of sets up this dichotomy as like science on the one hand and faith and religion on the other hand. And of course, the story ends up supporting the idea that faith and religion is superior and that the quote-unquote natural order of things, that is one that is dictated by God or the great chain of being, is the order that at the end of the film is upheld. That has always spoken to me as kind of an anti-science message and one that I'm not particularly on board with. So I've never really liked the Frankenstein story in all of its iterations for that reason. Nevertheless, I do think that there are elements of both of these films that are really good, and elements of both of these films that I can sort of glom onto from a more technical standpoint than from a ideological standpoint. I think that it's unfair to a movie to say, oh, this is a one-star movie just because it purports an ideology with which I disagree. I think that's unfair to the movie and unfair to the creators and unfair to the fans of the film. So I'm not willing to do that with Frankenstein or Young Frankenstein. But as a whole, and certainly as we're talking about the philosophy of these films, I do think we have to talk about how the basic story of these films relate to a anti-science position.
So I would like to throw in on this. First off, the word scientist didn't even come about before the story was written. There was no such thing as a scientist when Mary Shelley wrote this story. What was actually a thing that was occurring was a thing called Galvanism. I don't know if you guys have studied up on Galvanism. It's a very strange thing that people were working on. Basically, someone was taking severed frogs' legs and electrifying them and showing how their muscles would move once they've been severed, and had the idea that that's really what we're made of, is electrical stuff inside of us. Like if you cut off a finger, there's some electricity there. You know, not like laser beams shooting out of us, but like some electricity that's shooting through our bodies that makes us alive. And this was a huge thing that they were working on at this time. In fact, a couple of years before Mary Shelley wrote the story, there was a doctor who took this guy who was hung for murdering his child and wife, and electrified his head, which they had also done to cows' heads before this. And, you know, there's some winking and blinking and some spasming of their faces. And this was a thing that was very horrific to people. They saw this and they were like, that's fucking horrifying. Like, ew. Like the fact that you can make someone's head do that after they're already dead. And a lot of these horrifying things that happen to us even after death have been shown to happen with certain diseases now. Certain kinds of malaria have made dead creatures jerk and run about even though they're already dead. It's horrifying. And so the reason why it's horrifying is, when are we dead? What is dead? And I think that was what Mary Shelley was grasping onto. I think that was the thing that was really part of her. That's kind of scary. When are we dead? What is dead? Can we electrify a body and then be back to life? Would we be who we are? Which, honestly, Stephen King definitely kind of borrowed from with Pet Sematary, right? Like, what is dead? Is dead better? You know, it's kind of an old story, right? But Mary Shelley definitely is a product of her time with that form of storytelling and that form of horror. In a way, she kind of started that horror. Took doctors' experiments and turned it into a story that could scare people.
I have heard of what you're talking about, and I'm trying to think back into my college years, because I'm sure we talked about that kind of stuff in like some of the neuro classes that we had. But I want to make a distinction here really quickly between the Mary Shelley original story and the 1931 movie of Frankenstein, because I think one of those has a little bit of a different focus on this idea of kind of like weird, creepy, secret knowledge than the other one. So in Shelley's book, I think it's really interesting to note that the experiment, Frankenstein's monster, is actually worlds different than the one that we see in Boris Karloff's interpretation. For instance, I think the experiment ends up being more successful. So one really good example of that is that, partway through the book, we see the monster, eloquent and rational, making a case to Dr. Frankenstein to create a partner for him so that he won't be quite as lonely. And so like there's this level of intelligence there and this personhood that exists. And the reason that the monster was ostracized wasn't so much that it seemed monstrous, right? But just that Dr. Frankenstein was sort of disgusted at what he did and didn't really kind of like take responsibility for his creation. It seems like he was just taking that knowledge and applying it just for its own sake. Whereas in the movie, in the 1931 version, we see, yes, the monster is nonverbal. It's sort of like dragging around. It seems sort of like halfway there. It's disgusting looking. It's green. It's huge, and it has like these sort of like primal reactions to fire, and responds violently to these stimuli. And the message that I think we get that's different between these two different stories is that in Mary Shelley's story, it seems like, yes, it's definitely that Promethean tale of, someone brings down this light, this fire to humanity and is punished and, tormented for that gift of knowledge. But there's definitely more of this focus on, well, the reason that Dr. Frankenstein is tortured is because he failed to take responsibility for his creation. Whereas in the movie, it's just more about this God story. It's like, well, he literally says, I know what it's like to be God. And, it seems like he's suffering because he went too far and decided to play God. And I think, there's a very clear distinction between the main themes that we see in those two different mediums.
Yeah, it's almost an Icarus story in the 1931 version, because the 1931 version is all of, I'm going to just kind of go back to this point. It's about an anti-science point of view. And, Mary Shelley, she writes Frankenstein Origin of Species comes out 40 years later. At the time, it wasn't necessarily science, but it was a sense of I think that rather than galvanism, I think was the phrase you used, Shara, is that right? Rather than thinking of this as galvanism, at the time there were people called naturalists, and those were what our modern day scientists were, the people who were trying to figure out how nature worked. And of course, Darwin does that, and 40 years later with Origin of Species tries to figure out how nature works. And
I just want to point out, the galvanism isn't a religion or a viewpoint. It's an actual activity of putting electrical impulses into meat, essentially, to make it jerk around. And of course, with our nerve endings, the way that it's intermingled into our flesh, it makes it move around. I guess you would say realistically, it's a weird puppetry that occurs when we send those electrical impulses into our meat. It doesn't mean that we are sentient, though. And honestly, that's, I think, what makes it so horrifying. But galvanism is just simply thinking that you can bring life to something with electricity, and using electrical impulses into the meat to make it move again. And
it's drawing the line on where naturalism, natural experiment should start and stop. The original book might work in that way. It's one of the early science fiction books, and I think that, well, like a lot of early science fiction, it's anti-science. In fact, like a lot of present day science fiction, it's anti-science. There's if you look at science fiction through this lens, you'd be surprised the number of science fiction films and science fiction stories that are in fact anti-science. Jurassic Park is anti-science. You never thought let me get the quote right. You were so obsessed with whether or not you could, you never stopped to think whether or not you should. That is profoundly anti-science. We wouldn't have gone to the moon, or we wouldn't have done a whole bunch of scientific feats if we had thought along those lines. And it's all about, we get this very early in the 31 movie where they say that playing God is not the thing that man should do, and that is and that, to my mind, is an ideology and a philosophy that I don't necessarily agree with. Now, should we be ethical about the scientific experiments that we choose to do? Absolutely. Should we think about the type of scientific experiments that we should do? Absolutely. Should we create life out of dead bodies and brains that we find in a laboratory? Probably not. But if one of these scientific experiments certainly helps to extend the lives of humanity, then I don't see why that's a bad thing. And I wonder what the overall cultural effect of stories like these and the very idea of playing God works in a larger cultural sense. And so for that reason, I do want to go back to this point that the basic story of Frankenstein is anti-science. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means that that's something that I think we have to wrestle with when we're evaluating the 31 movie. I think that that's less true of Young Frankenstein, but I think Young Frankenstein is trying to do vastly different things than the 31 film.
Yeah, so actually, if we could talk about that really quickly. So I did want to pick that not only just for the narrative reasons, but also because I think it's interesting to have kind of I'm not even sure if it's like a satire on that idea, right? So it's like I agree that there are these like deep sort of like anti-science sentiments in the 31 film. And you kind of see that there because, of course, whenever Frederick sort of goes down that same path, he ends up making a lot of the same mistakes. And not just because like the film is absolutely inundated with comedy. Obviously, it's a Mel Brooks film. But I think really what they end up doing, I think, is absolutely profound in that, you have him creating this monster just because he can. He finds the notes. He's like, he's reading through this with this fervor, and he's like, it just might work. It could work. Like that was his big breakthrough. It's like he's doubting his grandfather this entire time, thinking he's a quack, making a mockery of him, trying to distance himself from this name. And then as soon as he finds the research notes, he's completely in because of the possibility that he could have the ability to raise dead tissue. There's no other further like discussion about it. It's like, can he do this? Maybe. Well, wow, that's pretty interesting. Let me go ahead and give this a shot because it might be a huge contribution to the existing scientific literature or whatever. And of course, so this ends up being like a huge mistake. He also ends up getting an abnormal brain and putting it into the body. So we have this nonverbal sort of hulking creature who ends up mistakenly almost hurting a girl, just exactly the same way in the 1931 version. But at the end, instead of the monster being burned to death and attacked by the villagers, we have him saying, well, I need to take responsibility for this, kind of like that ethical question, right? It's like, okay, what have I wrought? What have I done? How can I save this being who is clearly undergoing this sort of fear and this existential horror of its own, instead of me being the monster, which I think there's an argument that depending on the book or the film, it's either Victor or Henry Frankenstein is clearly the monster in those stories because of his decisions. Frederick is like, I am going to step up and I'm going to be a moral agent and responsible for this, and I'm going to sacrifice myself to rectify these mistakes. And so at the end of that movie, I think we get a drastically different message because it's not that we shouldn't make these attempts at gaining new, almost dangerous, sort of like creepy, mysterious knowledge, as long as we're ready to take responsibility for them and take the actions necessary to, recognize the consequences, right? Like, I really think that's the core underlying theme, even though, of course, it's a comedy movie. It's very funny. If you really dig down into it and how it sort of subverts the Frankenstein story, I think it becomes almost like, yes, science can be dangerous and scary, but if we take responsibility and we do things ethically, we can come up with these sort of like these groundbreaking revolutionary advances in medical science, of course, but in all of our generation of knowledge and so on and so forth. Because if you think about this, the fact that he's able to stabilize that experiment, the fact that he's successfully raised a stable person from nothing, from parts, you then could presume that after that story, he is probably the biggest thing since sliced bread in the scientific community. He's come up with this huge breakthrough in medical science because he succeeded, right? I mean, like, he doesn't explicitly say that. You don't see him having all of this fame or whatever, but I think that's the real takeaway there, is that, he didn't make the same mistakes of his grandfather. Therefore, he was able to reap the benefits of his discoveries.
I want to agree with what you're saying, but I also want to complicate it a little bit. You're right. In your reply to Young Frankenstein also an anti-science film? I think you make a good case that perhaps it isn't. But you do have the theme of destiny running around in there, and that's not particularly scientific either. Like, that's not one of those themes that is particularly resonant within a scientific community. And that, yes, you're right that the idea that he could actually make this work is part of what motivates him. But then we get a long scene where he's doing this. Gene Wilder is doing Gene Wilder things and screaming out the word destiny. Is he motivated by scientific curiosity, or is he motivated by an idea of destiny, which negates the idea? Like, that's not a scientific thing. It's more along the lines of a spiritual thing, a spiritual motivation. And so then I wonder just what Brooks's film's point of view on the relationship of science and religion, and science and fate, and science and the giant so what. I don't know if that's entirely as clear as you made it. So.
I just want to throw out there, I think that it's not necessarily Brooks's film. I think that this is Gene Wilder's film. In fact, it was his idea when he was on the set of God damn it, what is the name of that movie where they're farting around the campfire? God damn it, I can't think of it.
Blazing Saddles?
Blazing Saddles, thank you. When they were on the set of Blazing Saddles, Gene Wilder came up with this idea and ran it past Brooks. So I feel like this is a Wilder idea, and I think the reason why it's a Wilder idea and why Brooks attached himself to it was daddy issues. Daddy issues are implanted so heavily in this. Now, in 1931, it was God. But this has been kind of turned into a dad thing, right? This is his own child, and you see this when they're in the cell, and he's like, oh, you're unloved, honey, blah, blah, blah. It's daddy issues, okay? So they made the understanding that when he was like, I'm a god, that's what dads do. When their children are born, they're like, my DNA is superior. I've formed new life. And you'll see a lot of, dudes react that way. Oh, look, they have all their fingers and toes. I'm obviously far superior. And this is also very much ingrained in the Young Frankenstein film. This idea of passing on your genes to create a superior ability. This is why the uncle had done all these things, and no matter how much he tried to be Frankenstein, he's a Frankenstein. Sorry, dude, that's what you are. It's in you. And this isn't faith. This is just your DNA determines a lot about who you are. I had never met my grandfather until I was 18 years old. He had ran off with some young girl before I was born, and we had never met. When I was 18, I met him. I look exactly like him. I talk exactly like him. I have very similar political views to him. And when I met him, it was weird. It was like looking in a mirror. It was creepy. I was like, no, you ran off. You ran away from your family. My mom was messed up because of you. You get out of here. And then I was like, oh, crap, though I'm so similar to him. Like, I can't escape that. That's not something that can go away. DNA is destiny. And I think that's what they're getting at with Young Frankenstein. I don't think it's a faith thing. It's a you pass on your genes and some similarities gets passed on to you. Even if you're an uncle. Like, I look a lot like my uncle, too. So I can't escape these things. I don't know. I don't see it as a religious passing on. I see it as we pass on our destinies to our children and to our children's children, and maybe even to our nieces and nephews. And that the things that we're working on and the things that we care about can be passed on as a thing that they care about. It's not necessarily destiny as so much as it's obvious. Like, this is something that people are pushing you to do. That's why a lot of lawyers will have lawyers and a lot of doctors will have doctors. It's not necessarily that it's in their gene pool necessarily, but it's there's a lot of things going on there. It's a lot more complicated. And I think Young Frankenstein makes fun of that. I think it's a satire of that. That no matter how much you try to be different and try to differentiate yourself as something that's not like your family, you're probably a lot like your family.
So I can buy the idea that when he's screaming destiny in the very Gene Wilder way that Gene Wilder screams destiny, I can buy that has something to do with a familial relationship. And I can even buy that there is a father-son relationship that's built between Frankenstein the doctor and Frankenstein's and the Peter Boyle character, which I really don't like calling him either the monster or the creature. Either of those don't really seem to fit for me, although of course those are the titles.
He's the guy that's good in bed.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I got things to say about Mel Brooks's understanding of sexuality a little bit later, but for right now, he's there. So I can buy that there's sort of a relationship between a father-son relationship between the grandparent, I think it was, and Frankenstein, who we see in the Gene Wilder character. And I can buy that there's a father-son relationship between Gene Wilder's character and Peter Boyle's character. What I have trouble understanding is what coherent thing this film is saying about father-son relationships. And I'm having trouble understanding if you're making the argument, and I'm willing to go with you in this. If you're making the argument that this is satirizing something about father and son relationships, I'm happy to sort of see that. But I don't understand what the target of the satire is, and I don't know what it's saying in targeting that satirical relationship. Can you suss that out for me, or?
Maybe it's poorly done. I don't know, but
no,
I think it's pretty obviously a part of the theme, like that. His uncle was a particular way, and no matter how much he tried to escape it, even by changing the pronunciation of his name, because he didn't want to be attached to that legacy, and he wanted to make something new of himself, which was the comedy behind it. And that was actually the way he sold it to Brooks, and how Brooks sold it to the I can't remember who did it now. Fuck. Doesn't matter.
Whoever, yeah.
The studio people. Basically, the idea was the reason why this is different from all the other remakes of this story is that he doesn't want to be a Frankenstein. He doesn't want to be attached to that. And he's trying to battle against that destiny, against what his DNA has put out for him to be. And that's what was supposed to be comical about it. And that's why everybody was sold on making the film, was this idea of, no, I am Frankenstein. Fine, I'm Igor. It's supposed to be funny. It's a denial of your familial roots while still going into who you are based off of your familiar roots. And sometimes things just happen because DNA is pretty strong. I don't know how that necessarily is like a hilarious. I can't explain why that's comical, but that's what was sold to Brooks and the people who made the film, and they thought it was funny. And Gene Wilder came up with it, and he's pretty funny. So yeah, there it is. I can't try to sell to you why that's funny, except for say that that's why it was sold. I don't know. I don't know how to sell it to you. I'm not trying to make a movie. But some people thought that was funny.
I mean, I can definitely see it being thematically relevant here because, in the first one and in Young Frankenstein, or in the 1931 Frankenstein and the Young Frankenstein, identity, I think, is a huge theme. And even in Mary Shelley's book, right? I mean, there's this whole this existential sort of not necessarily maybe existential dread and sort of struggle here because again, the monster comes into being not knowing who the hell it is, and then everyone sort of teaches it that it's a monster. Dr. Frankenstein sort of like tries to take on the identity of this godlike figure, but is unable to take on the responsibility of a godlike figure. And then Frederick Frankenstein is fighting against his identity as a Frankenstein because of the sins of his father, but then finally has to accept again who he really is, I think, which is, obviously someone who is a lot more like his grandfather than he would like to believe. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, so we have this sort of like shifting identity, people fighting against who they really are, people trying to figure out who they are, and the conflict that arises because of that. And that, I think, probably is sort of like how we tie in thematically, like all across the Frankenstein sort of like mythology. And then this sort of like point about destiny is that, you have this true identity, and then there's this identity that you want to believe that you are. And then eventually there's going to be this reckoning of the two. Originally with Frankenstein thinking he's a god, but no, he's just kind of like this irresponsible sort of like dude who is not ready to wield the power that he discovered and found for himself. And then in Frederick Frankenstein, when, he wants to be a credible sort of like medical doctor and scientist and be objective in facts and logic and rationality, when he actually does have this sort of part of him that wants to reach a little bit farther and reach a little bit too close to the sun.
Once again, we have Icarus popping up in our Frankenstein again.
It's apropos. It's a good one. It's a good tie-in.
Yeah, it certainly is, and I think that both all versions of the story reach for an Icarus-like mythology, basically, that the creation of life outside of the traditional quote-unquote naturalistic means is a problem to be solved. Now, in Frankenstein 31, it's solved by murdering the creature, first disavowing the creature, being talked into despising your own creation, and then disavowing the creature, and then murdering the creature. In Young Frankenstein, it is literally, and this goes to your point, Shara, giving a piece of yourself into the creature that you created, as they do in the final experiment, so to speak. And I think that both of those do relate to in any case, the lesson of these stories is don't do this thing. Or if you do this thing, it will cost you a piece of yourself. And while that has an upending in Young Frankenstein, it has a somewhat down ending in Frankenstein 31, although I think Frankenstein 31 doesn't even punish the good doctor, so to speak, because he probably will be quite all right. The other guy didn't get in and steal his girl. Yeah, he fell off of a windmill, but it looks like he's going to be all right. At the end, he gets married. Everything's going to be fine for him. At the end of Young Frankenstein, he apparently has a bigger penis. Those are like, it's
or just knows how to use it better. We don't know exactly what Brooks is trying to get out there. It makes women sing. I don't understand. I don't.
Yeah, weird. Isn't that exactly how that works, Shara? That as soon as you
enter and no.
I'm surprised you were able to do that just on command here. I didn't know that was.
I used to sing on stage. What can I say? Right. I can't do it anymore, though. But no, it is very. Both of them end dumb, and that's my main contention with both of these films. They both end very dumb, and that's just, I know, very subjective, but from what I know from the actual story,
I get on board with they end dumb.
They both end dumb. It's nothing against any of these people, though, that tried to make something for Hollywood. I think it's Hollywood restrictions that led to the dumb. People need happy endings. People don't like the reality of situations. Generally, what actually happens with your creations or your children that you manufacture with your DNA is that they go off and do their own fucking thing, and you're probably not okay with it. How many of your parents are very disappointed in what you've become? I mean, it's just part of the reality, and nobody wants to end a movie that way. Nobody wants to end a movie with the parents disappointed in their children.
Well, which, by the way, I think if we could, let's talk about the book a little bit there too, because that's why I think I'm so mad at the 31 film, is because in the book, Frankenstein he suffers for his mistake, man. Like it's not even just like making the creation that is a mistake, but the fact that he immediately is disgusted with what he's done and runs away from it, and then the monster gets out and runs away, and then suffers and is lonely and alienated, and then even has like a reckoning with the doctor, and then at every single point where the doctor has a chance to sort of take responsibility and make amends and do the right thing, he fails to do so, and he continues to fail to do so until he loses his friends, he loses his family. Like, this monster is like murdering the people he knows, and eventually does in fact lose his girl, because Elizabeth in the book ends up being murdered by the monster. And it's not until like the very end where we see Dr. Frankenstein. He's finally had enough, and he's chasing after the monster to go and kill it, which, by the way, is sort of giving the monster what it wants, because all he really wanted was just like the attention of his creator, and then ends up in the Arctic Circle and then dies, I guess, of exhaustion or something like that. So that is I think a much better way to tell the story. I am so pissed that it was so simplistic in the 31 version, where it's just the monster dies and then everyone's fine, and it kind of like ends on this happy note and they're cheersing with wine. It's like, what are you doing? Seriously? This is the story you want to tell? I don't know. It's just, I feel like they got it so wrong. And that's in fact why I think that Young Frankenstein didn't end quite as dumb as you might say, because it's so closely related. I think it's more closely related to the book than the 31 film in that regard, because the answer is yes, you did this thing. Now it might require a little bit of a personal sacrifice. You've got to take responsibility. And like that seems to be in the book. That would have been Frankenstein's answer. That would have been the thing that got him out of all the trouble and the suffering, is just taking responsibility for his creation. And he never did, but Frederick did, and it turned out okay. I think
Perfect. I agree
Perfect.
that Frederick did it way better. And it's just, I think that the story was meant to have a theme of almost regret. And I know we talked about this in our last review of a film where we talk about regret, but a regret for ways that you did things. And I think that's really what the theme is being a parent and having regret and hoping that like somehow it can get better. It's a satire though, right? So when it's a satire, it's like, okay, this is actually how you fix it, dumb shit. And it's hilarious. It works as a comedy for sure. But it doesn't necessarily go with the theme of regret. And should it end unhappy in a comedy? Probably not. I mean, there's definitely an argument that would be really strange to end with it being sad. So it definitely subverted the story and led to more of a satire and a comedy. And like, hey, this is actually how you raise your children well, is put a part of yourself into them and actually care. You know? Duh.
I think that's great. And in fact, I sort of, to combine your point with Ben's point, the best way to end it is having the brain switching experiment actually switch their brains. And so that at the end of Young Frankenstein is nonverbal, unable to articulate and unable to move as well as he can. And then Peter Boyle is the one who gives the moving monologue.
So it's an actual sacrifice.
Right. So that the experiment actually costs Frankenstein his identity, and that those identities end up switching. That makes a ton of sense to me, both thematically, and I think that works as a joke either. We'll talk about, apparently I'm going to get into it very shortly, but I'm uncomfortable with the ending where Gene Wilder kind of gives this look at the camera and then has sex with Cloris Leachman, and then she sings, hearkening back to Peter Boyle's sexual experience. I find that to be, I find that to be too pat and too sophomoric of a joke to a film that deserves better. And while we're on the subject of sexuality in Young Frankenstein, this movie has a rape joke. I don't.
Two rape jokes, and they're
two-
the same rape joke.
Right. I mean, that's you know,
Like,
I
if
know
it
that.
didn't work this time, maybe this time. Hoo hoo ha ha.
Yeah, I mean, just let's suss out this rape joke to make sure that, because my suspicion is that I say this this movie has a rape joke, and then suddenly the comments go before we can even explain what the rape joke is and why it's a fucking rape joke. And you know, we've got the Madeline Kahn character. She is resisting Peter Boyle's character's advances. Um, she says no. She's clearly not into it. Then he takes out his penis. She looks at it and stops resisting as much. And then he has sex with her. She sings. And because he is apparently good at sex, it was okay, quote unquote, to rape her. And that was it's a similar joke that they play in Blazing Saddles. They do a joke similar to this in Blazing Saddles, but with an added racial element. And it seems to me that Mel Brooks thinks that all female sexuality has to, like, the only thing that you need to please a woman is a abnormally large member, and that's it. That's his the extent of
I
his
don't know if it's a
understanding
dick
of female
size
sexuality.
joke, though. I don't know if
The-
it's a dick size joke,
I
and
think-
here's why.
I think it is. Well, I'll
It
throw this in here
it
really quick.
might be.
Okay.
It might be a dick size joke, but I want to throw out a real life story of Brooks. And this is not a story told by him. This is told by his second wife, the chick who played Mrs. Robinson in The Graduate. So the one that he was married to the longest before she died. Yes, Anne Baycroft. So she was in a film, or I think she was filming something. I don't know what it was. It might have been a commercial, it might have been whatever. She was filming something. And then Mel Brooks came over and he was like, "I'm Mel Brooks," and introduced himself that way to her. She didn't see what he looked like, but she imagined this like amazing Robert Redford type character. And then when she sees who he is, his confidence may have been very large, but his, personage is not so large. And so she was just like, what the hell? But then she kept on going places, and he'd be like, where are you going? And she'd say, I'm going here. And he's like, so am I. And he was stalking her, essentially, which she took a liking to, and just kept going to different places, telling him where she would go. He'd be there, and she enjoyed it. And that was their back and forth before they got married. That is their love story. Their love story is him being larger than life in his way of exuding himself, and then stalking her until she gave in. And that's their love story. And it might be part of how he writes his stories, honestly. I don't know, but that's her version of events. And she thought it was very romantic. She saw it as something very sweet to talk about. So I don't know, maybe it's a very different time. I can't speak to Mrs. Robinson's kinks. Apparently she likes college boys and Mel Brooks. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw in there just like about the dinner scene really quick. So there is kind of like a rule of threes thing about this. So they do the size joke 3 times. The two that we've already talked about, the end of the movie, and then in the scene with like Madeline Kahn and the monster. And then the first, whenever they're talking about the proportions that they would have to have of like a body to be able to withstand the electric current. And then Inga at one point is like, wow, he would have to have like an enormous, insert German word for penis here. And Gene Wilder's like, well, goes without saying. So I think that's an indication of exactly what kind of joke they were going for there.
Right. And I guess what I'm arguing here is that I mean, I'm not necessarily arguing too much here. I'm saying that the film has a joke that certainly by today's standards would be inappropriate. And maybe it's possible that Anne Bancroft's courtship with Mel Brooks by today's standards would be inappropriate or not. I don't know. I'll leave that to the real SJWs to decide, not us. But I would, I would say, but what I am arguing here is that the portrayal of sexuality, specifically female sexuality, within Young Frankenstein is sophomoric and simplistic. That is the extent of what I'm saying about the film here. And
I can agree there.
Yeah, I mean that's the extent of the argument, and I think that it's a legitimate thing to talk about when we're evaluating the movie, especially considering that that's how they choose to end the movie. They choose to end the movie on another dick joke, which this is a movie that deserves better than that. And if we're going to talk about how this film thematically treats the creation of the creature, then we need to talk about, you know, the ending and the final conclusion of the film.
It might have worked better if he passed his large dick energy, his big dick energy, onto the monster. I think it might have worked better. The fact that the big dick energy came from his son or his creation is weird. It doesn't make sense. But if he would have passed his big dick energy onto the monster, that would have been fucking hilarious to today's standards. So maybe it's a time frame thing, but yeah.
And not only that, that would fit so much better with the argument that you were making earlier, that this is a film about father-son relationships. And the idea that the son would then pass on his big dick to the father I don't think that's how that works. That's a little weird. And so if we're talking about thematic cohesion within this farcical comedy, then that I think your rewrite of the joke makes much more sense.
And are we saying that if you have a small brain that you have a big dick, and if you have a big brain you have a small dick? I don't know if that's what's implied, but that's sad.
I mean, I think that both movies are definitely making. Both movies seem to be making the argument that there's an antithetical relationship that's being set up in both of these movies, right? Where on the one hand we have Frankenstein or Frankenstein, who is the intellect. He is the ego or superego. Well, no, he would be the ego, and you have the creature or the monster, Boris Karloff and Peter Boyle's characters, who are the id. They are primarily sexual. They are primarily nonverbal. They're motivated by very simplistic moral and physical reasonings. And so as a result of that, I think you do have these deliberate antitheses set up, which would then argue that the intellect is incapable or less capable, shall we say, of sexual gratification and less in touch with sexuality, which is a problematic argument, I would say. And it's an argument that is foisted onto these films. It's not necessarily an argument that I think occurs in the original source material, but of course I'm of the books don't matter point of view. So for me, it doesn't, I don't necessarily put it on myself to criticize these films based upon Shelley, but if I am going to, these are statements the filmmakers themselves are foisting onto these things, not necessarily something that's inherent in Shelley. And I realize that I'm talking myself into lower star ratings for these films. So I would somebody take over and make me like these movies more.
Go Ben.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Like I think that comedy, and this is something that I actually have to deal with, honestly, personally, a lot, is that comedy just doesn't seem to age well. You know what I mean? I mean, there's even, well, I mean, just like maybe just film in general, but yes, I mean, like obviously having a dick joke in a Mel Brooks film, you know, yes, that's probably what you would expect. Like if you've seen his other films, I mean, like History of the World, like obviously there's similar shit in there. And
Dark
that's
Helmet.
well, there you go. Right. The whole thing, like it's
Your
sort
Schwartz
of
is bigger than mine.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of like inundated within a lot of his movies. And like, I mean, it's like a pretty common basic form of comedy. It's not highbrow stuff that we're dealing with here, as far as like that's concerned. But yeah, I mean, like his movies might be a little bit dated, you know? And like, I mean, especially if I compare this to something like, you know, the earlier Bond films, which personally, I feel like there are a lot more graphic, problematic scenes as far as sexuality in those movies are concerned. It seems to be like a time period sort of thing, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, like some things just don't age super well.
Can I just say something though? I think this is a disservice against men. Can I be an MRA for a second? We'll switch from SJW to MRA. I think this is a disservice to men. Yeah, we'll be all the letters. I think this is a disservice to men. You can have big dick energy and be smart. Like, I don't understand this viewpoint. It's something that's foisted on women as well. Like, oh, you have the big titties and you're a Stacy. Okay, well, you're dumb. It's such a fucking dumb idea to attach what you look like to what your intelligence is. I don't understand doing that to men. I don't understand doing it to women. I don't understand why that's funny. I don't understand why people think that that's a flip. It's a data joke, blah, blah, blah. It's still a dick joke, funny, but I don't like it. Like, I think that there are plenty of intelligent men with big dick energy. Like, you bitches exist, and I acknowledge your existence. So, like, I don't like that Mel Brooks wants to try to imply that, you know?
Right. And I want to be careful about applying 2019 standards to a 1970s movie.
I will apply it like crazy. I don't care, but you can do what you gotta do.
I mean, I want to be careful about it. I mean, I think clearly I'm the one who brought it up. So, I mean, obviously I do have concerns about these things, but in fairness to the film, I guess my overall point is that Young Frankenstein deserves better because it is a film with a lot of really funny moments. I mean, there's a reference to a Glenn Miller band joke that nobody gets. It's not even it's very, very, very few people will get it. And it's a sophisticated joke and it works. And I chuckled at it after I realized what it was. It's a nice joke. I think Frankenstein, I think that's funny. I think Igor, that's a clever little thing. I think Marty Feldman is fantastic in this movie. I think the moment where he drops the smart guy's brain and picks up the abnormal brain, and it's clearly labeled abnormal brain, do not use, is hanging a lantern on like how kind of dumb it was in the 31 version. I mean, this is clearly a movie that knows its source material and is making fun of its source material, and I really like that joke. So
can I point out the source material? Since you mentioned source material, can I point out the fact that the person who kept and held on to all the objects from the 31 film, Mel Brooks contacted him and was able to use all the original Frankenstein devices in Young Frankenstein. Those are all the same exact props from the 1931 version that Mel Brooks was able to borrow from movie history. And so they really did know their source material. In fact, they used their source material literally and physically. That is something beautiful, and kudos to them for understanding satire needs to go to that level. Like, take it to the highest level you can, right? It's not just silliness. It's pointing out some of the problems of it, right? That's what that brain part pointed out. It was like, that was really stupid. Like, that was so dumb.
And that's hilarious. That's a great joke, and it's hilarious, especially considering that you watch the 31 version, and he takes the brain, label and all, brings it to Frankenstein, and apparently Frankenstein puts this brain in this creation without reading the label on the jar that Fritz brings him. I mean, that's hilarious. That's a great joke. And, you even have the Madeline Kahn appearing with the Bride of Frankenstein wig and all of these things. This is a film that knows its source material. It's intelligent. It's good comedy mostly. But then at the same time, we get some of these problematic elements that are thrown in. And to me, those jokes speak of laziness. Those are easy jokes to make, and as a result, it's a movie that deserves better.
It's not wrong. It's eye roll.
Thank you. That's what I've been trying to say for the past 15 minutes, and you just summed it up in a single sentence.
There was a great theater story that was being told on stage around the time of Mary Shelley. So it's possible she could have seen this performed on a stage. They took a bunch of vegetables and had them pieced together like a human body to form like a puppet, and made it come to life like a human being made of vegetables, performed on the stage and in a comedic way. And it is entirely possible that Mary Shelley might have seen that on top of, the Galvanism stuff and the news stories that could have inspired some of her storytelling, which I think is extraordinarily interesting. It could be just her being informed about news of the day, as well as being culturally inspired by some of the stuff that was being performed in her time that led to her story. But I don't know if you guys are aware of how the story was written. The Mary Shelley story was written. She was in a big giant mansion house with a bunch of her friends and a dude she was into. And they got stuck in the house during a storm. And so one of the guys that was there with her was like, hey, let's try to write the best scary story. Let's all go into other rooms and write scary stories and see who writes the best scary story. At least that's how the legend goes. And that's how Frankenstein got written. Now, they all had their own little versions of stories. And yes, some of those people went on to write their own famous scary stories that are well known in our time. But she wrote Frankenstein during this storm of being trapped in a house and bored with her friends and trying to outright them.
You're certainly right, and this is one of, as I said before, one of the first science fiction stories that was written, and certainly within the context of the early 19th century, female writers were not common. Although, of course, we have Aphra Behn in the Restoration, and we have other George Eliot later on in the 19th century, and Georges Sand, who both had to sort of take on aliases and pen names in order to get their work published and accepted. Aphra Behn, however, was the first female writer in the 1600s in Britain, first female writer who was able to make a living out of writing. So Mary Shelley certainly has her place within the history of women writers, and certainly within the history of women science fiction writers. She is I struggle to find a 19th century female writer who's been as influential as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And she's in fact more well known than her husband, Percy Shelley, who's sort of a second-rate poet, in my view. But and it's even interesting to note that in the 1931 version, she is credited as being Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, based upon the novel by Mrs. Percy B. Shelley rather than based upon the novel by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. It isn't until the Kenneth Branagh version in the 90s when it becomes Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the title. And of course, any film that that has the author's name in the title is the film that diverges most from the actual source material, because that movie is not the book. And while we're speaking of adaptations and other versions of this, I want to throw a quick shout out to the Danny Boyle. This is a stage play that was filmed, and it's a Danny Boyle directed production starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller, and it is astounding. And one of the most important things that this stage production does is restore the voice to the creature. And in both of the films that we're analyzing today, the quote unquote creature has no voice. The Boris Karloff version simply speaks in M's, and the Peter Boyle version largely speaks in M's. I guess one of the questions that occurred to our erstwhile and absent co-host, pour some out for our friend Noah. One of the questions that he sent in our group chat before we analyzed this film was, if the monster could, if the creature could speak, what would he say? And I thought that was a fascinating question, especially when we're analyzing the Karloff version, that I think strips the creature even more of its agency than the Young Frankenstein version. But what do you guys think about that?
I would just like to throw out there, and I will send this over to you, Ben, for sure, because I think you'll have a lot more insight, honestly. But I just want to throw this out there, that there are other ways of communicating than with words. And in both of the films, he communicates with way more than words. When he's talking to the blind man and to the child, it is very obvious that he cares about people. It's very obvious that he cares for the finer things. It's very obvious that he wants to do what's right. He just doesn't know how to. And I think he communicates it very well. Now, it may not be accurate to the book or how the story was supposed to be told, but in both of the movies, I think that it's very obvious that he's a compassionate and loving person. It's seen as wrong. So, for instance, in the 31 version, when he's with the child, he falls in love, and not in a creepy pedophile way. He falls in love with childhood innocence, with flowers, with gifts, with the beauty of the world and humanity. And you can tell that. He just doesn't understand it, and something accidentally happens and they perceive it incorrectly. And when he's with the blind man introduces him to the finer things in life and teaches him not to be so afraid of some of the things he's afraid of. Because he's a wise man. He's the guy who's taking him on the journey that his father or God should have taken him through. And in a way, it's admonishing God. It's admonishing Father. Sometimes there's wiser people that you run into that teach you the better things. And those two characters are the most imperative and important of the story. The blind man and the girl are who raise this poor creature. It is not Frankenstein who raises him. It is the elderly and the childlike innocence. And that is what real good storytelling tells us every time. If we have wisdom and if we have love, we become better humans. And that's why it's such a great story for me. I would like to hear what Ben has to say, though. That's just my interpretation of those that raise the creature, but and how he communicates. But I don't know what Ben's going to say. So now I'm like almost worried.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I definitely see that. And one of the things I thought about as I was watching the 1931 version is how similar the monster, the creature, seemed to be to I forget the name, but we've all seen it, of Mice and Men, right? So it's like we have this
Lenny.
character that's Lenny, yeah. Where, I mean, we have this character who is very large and probably too strong for his own good, and very simple and very innocent, and can't help but accidentally, hurting people sometimes. And because of that, eventually the people that are around seeing this happening come after him and have to try and kill him. And then his friend, puts him sort of out of his misery because he should be the one to do it. He doesn't want these cruel sort of mob mentality, whatever, coming after him and putting him through all this like pain and, whatever. He just kind of wants it to be quick and this creature's eventual suffering. But yeah, I mean, I saw that as being very, very similar. There's this idea that there is this power in this body, but it is led by, a mind that just isn't 100% completely fully developed, which of course speaks to a childlike innocence, but also, this sort of like fearful reactions and a misunderstanding of the world and, trying to control things in ways that end up just doing more harm than good. But honestly, like as far as the 1931 Frankenstein, I think like Karloff's performance is probably my favorite part of this entire story. Like obviously, I have some issues with like the thematic elements and stuff, and especially compared to the original work, I think the book was much better in telling the important story that we have there. But yeah, I mean, as far as like the communication style of Karloff and portraying this monster is fantastic, because in many ways he really doesn't even seem to need words. There are a couple of scenes in here where you look into the expression that he's making and how he's outstretching his hands, particularly. And Noah pointed this out as well. There's one scene where he's sitting in a chair and he's sort of like looking up and reaching for this beam of light. And it's so incredibly telling of the monster's psychology, but also kind of like thematic of, the search for meaning and like looking for guidance and almost like maybe necessarily a metaphor for divine absence in a lot of ways. It's absolutely incredible. I just think
that's a really interesting point, Ben. I hadn't thought of that before. So can you kind of explore that a little bit more? This idea of the monster and a theme of divine absence in the 1931 version, because I've always read the 31 version as being there is a God. God has certain limits. Frankenstein he went beyond those limits. And so as a result of that, the product of him going beyond those limits must be destroyed. And so I've never really thought of the film as having a theme of divine absence. Yet what you talked about right then with that particular shot, and I remember that shot very well, but that makes a ton of sense to me. So can you you understand why I'm a little confused and why I also am very interested in what you're saying?
Yeah, sure. I see how the movie could be read in the way that you're talking about. Like, obviously, we have Henry Frankenstein there acting as sort of like the God the Father, the creator, bringing the monster into the world and sort of having its own failings. I think if anything, like you could definitely see this as sort of Nietzschean in a lot of ways, obviously, as seemingly like every horror film is just Nietzschean. So, I mean, we might as well just go ahead and say that. But in this one in particular, because, he is sort of let down, I think, by the abilities of Frankenstein, because Frankenstein can't rise up to that level. He sees himself as a god, but I really don't think that obviously he's meant to be taken that way as an audience. Like we see that his folly in those statements, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And that's why he eventually fails, because he tries to take on that role and fails. You could almost see him as like a failed god. So I don't think he's necessarily supposed to fill that role in a literal sense. It's just that he sees himself that way, and just simply cannot rise to the task. So if you want to think about it that way, yes, there is sort of like a divine absence because of Frankenstein's own sort of like folly, but also because in a lot of ways, I think the monster is meant to be perceived as sort of like more human or more basically human than Frankenstein, because while Frankenstein is supposed to be trying to transcend and reach past what he actually is and sort of deny that human identity, the monster is portrayed, especially in the early parts of his life and his time on screen, is sort of lost. He's seeking, he's looking, he's outstretching, he's waiting to be to be given sort of like this sense of identity and this guidance, and he's looking for it, and it never happens. Like, it's never given to him. He's simply lost in sort of the wilderness and left to be eaten alive by the wolves in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, he's there, he's looking for help, he's looking for answers, and none come. There's only suffering to be found, and misunderstanding and alienation and loneliness. And so, I mean, I think that if you break that down to its elements and sort of compare that to the search for meaning that we all have, I think that's absolutely apropos. I mean, we look out into the void or into the sky, like looking for something to fill that sense of meaning within us, that God hole, if you will, that we talk about in a lot of different movies, and no answers come. And obviously it's a common theme among theology that, whenever we're at our deepest and our darkest moments, we look out and we look for those answers, and again, like, no answers come. No matter how faithful you are, horrible things continue to happen, and nothing seems to stop and intervene in that. So, as a microcosm, I think that that's an absolutely great way to sort of portray that. We see all of that meaning with the couple of seconds where we look at Boris Karloff's face, and the eventual sort of like outcome of that is that, well, he's sort of left to fend for himself and killed.
Right.
There is no salvation, essentially.
Yeah, I think I was sort of trying to square your reading and your interpretation with my own, and I think I was able to do it based upon all the things you're saying. Man cannot be God. Man tries to be God. Man fails at being God. The creation looks to man to fulfill the needs that God supposedly gives. Man, being unable to be God, is unable to fulfill those needs. Therefore, creature must be killed. That makes a ton of sense to me within the context of both the traditional interpretation of the Frankenstein story and what we're deliberately told this movie is about when the guy walks up on stage and says, "This is what the movie's about." And okay, now I don't need to watch your movie, but thank you. Yeah, I mean,
he's like, "Leave now." Okay, I guess you're gonna stay. Yeah, what the fuck did you think I came here for? Like, what are you talking about, bro? I've warned you. Ooh, it's it's probably a product of its time. I don't know.
And that makes a ton of sense within the context of where we were in 1931 as it related to cinema. And in the early days of cinema, they just placed the camera on a tripod, and they had all of the action occur right in front of you. So the basic idea of cinematography in the very, very early days of filmmaking was, we are going to take you to a play, and we are going to give you the front row seat to a play. And so all of the cinematography was essentially, what would you see if you were on the front row seat of a stage production. Those traditions and that basic thought process as it related to early cinematography continued up until the mid 30s in some cases. It wasn't until we had innovations in cinematography where we started to invent the close-up and invent other behaviors or other cinematography,
film language.
Thank you very much.
Let's go film language.
Oddly enough, D.W. Griffith was one of the early innovators as it related to understanding film language. But what we see at the very beginning of the 31 version is what stuck around from the idea that you are going to sit in the first row of a play. And so when the guy walks out and introduces the play, that's basic film language for 1931, for that time.
But what's fun is, when you look at Young Frankenstein, this is why I really jumped at the chance to talk about 31 Frankenstein with Young Frankenstein. And that's why when Ben mentioned this, I was like, yes, let's do it now. It's the tap dancing number, okay? Like, motherfuckers, can we talk about the tap dancing number? So Puttin on the Ritz is tapping into that part, that element of the old school. The play is a movie, the movie is a play. You're at the front row. And it's taking that old school view of film going and taking it to a hilarious height, right?
Vaudeville.
Vaudeville, exactly. It's beautiful. And the fact that Brooks fought for it to be in black and white, first of all, huge. Got it in black and white, perfect. Now we have a theater stage number as part of the gags of Frankenstein. Oh, okay. So, I don't know if you guys know this backstory. If you do already, I'm sorry, you've already heard it. But Wilder loved that Puttin' on the Ritz number. He thought it was amazing. He thought it was hilarious as all holy hell. Now, there are about 3/4 of the gags that got removed from the film. Brooks cut so much. He put all the gags out to audiences. If they weren't laughing hard enough, he cut them. He goes to Wilder about the Puttin' on the Ritz, and Frankenstein being like, ah, making little grunting noises, which totally makes fun of the I can't make any vocalizations. He's singing and performing his grunts. Hilarious fucking putting on the black and white theater stage shit. And Brooks goes to Wilder and says, we're cutting it. And Wilder goes to tears and rage and starts breaking stuff and throwing a fit over the fact that he's going to cut the Puttin' on the Ritz number. And then Brooks goes, well, I just wanted to make sure that you stood behind the number. So we're definitely keeping it. We were going to keep it anyway. But I just wanted to make sure you actually stood behind. And he was fucking with him and manipulating him psychologically. Brooks is a really messed up person, by the way. He does this kind of stuff all the time. If you look into his way of doing things, it's quite messed up. He's totally he's totally messed up on how he forces things to happen, but also messes with your mind. And he did that to Wilder, and Wilder was like, what the hell is wrong with you, bro? But at the same time, he knew that he stood by that number. And it is one of the main parts of Young Frankenstein. Like, a lot of people stand by it now. So, I don't know. Is Brooks an asshole? Is he a monster too? Is he Frankenstein himself? I don't fucking know, but that story is Inception to me.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it's a funny bit, and I think it works very well. I'm happy that it stayed in the movie, especially because I think it underscores the creature's nonverbal aspects. And in the captions, at least, it says every time it goes to Peter Boyle's line, it's on the Ritz. And so that the actual word Ritz is the only one that he's able to say, which I think is very funny. That's a great gag. And as it, it seems like I'm shitting on Young Frankenstein a lot, but there are things about this film that I genuinely enjoy.
Yeah, no, the dance scene in this is absolutely phenomenal. It's like one of the funniest things I think, honestly, in the entire movie. And this actually kind of goes back to the nonverbal stuff that we were talking about earlier, because yes, I mean, like the funny part of this, I guess, like the gag is that, he's trying to sing this song and can't get the words right, but there's also like these funny facial reactions that he does, you know what I mean? And I'm thinking about like when Gene Wilder does the little nudge like that, and he's just like, so, I mean, he's like completely expressive in his face in sort of like a normal, genuine way. And that sort of like, I think, cuts through the whole monster part a little bit. I don't know. It's just funny. Like, the whole thing is absolutely hilarious to me. I do want to I think let's go ahead and start angling this toward closing thoughts, though. But before we do that, is there anything else that we want to cover? Any other like main themes or ideas before we start jumping into the ratings?
I just want to throw out there that Young Frankenstein had a way better soundtrack than 31. End of story.
Well, anytime you have Puttin on the Ritz in your soundtrack, you're doing well. Yeah, I mean, one other thing that I wanted to talk about, and we probably should have talked about this when we were talking about the science, these films' relationship to science, and that is these films' relationship and this story's relationship to the Enlightenment, and the idea that this is almost a modern or postmodern film, or modern or postmodern story, even before modernism or postmodernism became a thing. In its discussions about in its warnings about science, and even in its placing of the characters as foremost, like even in its creation of the creature as a sympathetic character, I think it's drawing our attention to a modern or postmodern idea, and that is that science cannot solve everything. Science cannot solve everything, and that it is individual human agency where many of us should pay many of us should pay attention to. And I think that's a brilliant like a really forward-thinking idea by Mary Shelley, and it's slightly carried through in the film versions, but it is kind of interesting that this is a post-Enlightenment film, or post-Enlightenment story, rather, post-Enlightenment book, even during the Enlightenment, and I find that to be an interesting aspect of this. But
so you're saying that Frankenstein is a meme?
Well, it's not really a meme. It's just
it is. It's a fucking meme, and it has spread, and that's why there's so many different movies of it. I'm not trying to speak for you. I'm just seeing where I go with it.
No, I mean, what I'm arguing is that the Enlightenment was about taxonomies. It was about science. It was about the search for truth and the search for meaning. And in a sympathetic portrayal of the creature, it places the locus of that meaning on individual expression. And that is an interesting and forward-thinking idea in the time when this book was written. And that's the only point that I'm making. That
you're describing memes to me still.
That's
so.
not memes are entirely postmodern. Like that is the memes are the reappropriation of previous rhetoric, rhetorical items in a new rhetorical concept or new rhetorical situation. That is entirely postmodern. But yeah, I mean, maybe it's just a meme. You're right. Do you want to go ahead and give your final thoughts first, Shara?
Oh, I would like to know, what are we doing? Am I rating both movies? Like, what is our...
Yeah, we're doing both movies. Both movies are going on the spreadsheet. Both movies are going in the contest.
Holy shit, we're putting a comedy on the spreadsheet.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if Young Frankenstein wins the tournament?
Oh, this is so hard.
Do it for the meme, guys.
A meme within a meme, so therefore Shia LaBeouf.
Exactly.
Oh, God. Okay, I'll go first.
I'll go second.
Frankenstein 31 is a film that has always spoke to me, especially the interaction that the creature has with the blind man and the child, as well as trying to figure out its place in the world. This is something that anyone could relate to, feeling like a monster. There are tons of people out there in this world today that feel like they are a monster. There are people that say they relate to Shrek. and they feel like monsters themselves. The thing is, when we talk about that, we feel like it's better that we just die. And 31 Frankenstein kind of gives you that mentality that if you are this kind of monster, even though you may have compassion, even though you have the ability to have wisdom, you should probably just die. That is a horrible message. And that's sad. I don't agree with that message at all in any way, shape, or form. And in that way, it's very dated. And it doesn't actually equate with what the original story ever said anyway. But it is a product of its time, and I think is a product of toxic masculinity, and is a sad, sad state of affairs that has been pushed onto us even in our modern day. And it makes me sad. I wish that people didn't feel so alone and so sad. And I wish people could understand that there are plenty of people out there that will be there for them, and that will care for them, and that will listen to them, and that will hear them out. So I almost feel like 31 Frankenstein is a suicidal tale. And it brings immense sadness and horror. And I hope that anybody who's watching this that is feeling sad and lonely in that way will reach out to us. And I hope that you know that you're not alone, and that you're not a monster, and that even Shrek and even Frankenstein had people that cared about him and liked him and wanted to give him flowers or give him food or cigars or, you know, be there for him. So you're not alone. So please reach out to people. But I do like the film in some ways, in that it did definitely bring sci-fi and monster movie madness to the forefront. There's so much to be said about what it brought to us. So I have to give it a higher rating just because of what it did for cinema and storytelling, even though it may have gone against the actual book story and even possibly perpetuated some negative ideas about, oh, if you're a monster, just die. As far as a film, I have to give it a 4 out of 5. Now, with Young Frankenstein, I absolutely enjoy the satire. Walk This Way inspired some Aerosmith songs. We have these crazy wild antics that are acted out that even when they were filming it, they couldn't stop laughing. Like, it took multiple shots to get through the comedy. It's absolute comedy gold. But moving past that, there are themes about fatherhood, about responsibility, about trying to integrate yourself into society and trying to do what's right for yourself to become a responsible human being that functions in the world. And this is something that could easily be attached to anybody that is having a hard time and struggling in social interaction. Once again, we're going to social interactions again. Yay, fun. But I feel like that's what the Frankenstein story is really trying to talk about. What makes us human? How do we connect with others? How do we get along? And how do we move forward? And I think Young Frankenstein does this very well, while satirizing some of the really stupid elements of 31. Like, it really fucks up 31 in a way that's hilarious, like the brain, picking the abnormal brain, and just, I think the other aspect is this god-like mentality that this supposed scientist had, but it's like, no, really, you're broken too. You need love too. You need this interaction too. We're really not all alone. We all need connection. We all need human interaction. So I don't know. There was something to Young Frankenstein that added to it. And actually, from most people I've talked to, they've never seen the 31. They've only seen Young Frankenstein. And it spoke to them and their loneliness and their sadness and their inability to connect with people. And I feel like the satire of that story still let those elements and those themes come out to help people understand that you're interconnected. We're all here for each other. So I almost feel like Young Frankenstein wins over 31. So I give it a 4.5 out of 5. And I'll let you guys continue.
Right. So I mean, I think some of those themes are important. But I've got to go a little bit lower than you on this one, Shara, because which is rather on brand for me, I think. We've got Frankenstein 31, which I'm going to first talk about some of its technical elements, which I think are quite good. I think Boris Karloff's performance is fantastic for the time. The cinematography is also quite good. Its special effects. I mean, of course, you know, what scientist needs that many Tesla coils? But nevertheless, there's some good production design, good cinematography. I think there are some classic scenes and classic performances, especially by Boris Karloff. Let me sort of go back to that. I mean, that's what I opened with and then veered on this cinematography bit. But Boris Karloff is the highlight of this movie, and it's a renowned performance for very good reason. He does such good body work, and really like an incredibly expressive face, as Ben has alluded to in some of his thoughts throughout this podcast. So it's as though he is able to convey the entire world of a character that is at war with himself in just his face and just his eyes. And in addition to this body work that he was able to, it seems as though his inability to move is a handicap that is foisted upon him, and through his eyes you can tell his own frustration with his own body and his own ability to express himself. I think that this performance is nuanced and incredible for the time, and as a result of that, and only as a result of that, I'm giving the film 3 stars, and it's basically based upon Boris Karloff's performance and the influence of it. Now, I think it's dated. I think it's anti-science. I think I think its ending is dumb. I think it doesn't necessarily, I don't think that Frankenstein's character, Dr. Frankenstein's character, is adequately, like, that character journey isn't adequately explored. And so I essentially recommend it for film historians and film completionists more than I recommend it for a general audience, even though I like Boris Karloff's performance. Young Frankenstein was a film that I remembered very, very well. And on the rewatch, it wasn't as good as I remembered it to be. Some of that has to do with sort of 2019 sensibilities, as I made clear earlier. And some of it has to do with the fact that the jokes didn't work as well on me. And that may be because I remember the jokes, and so I didn't laugh now. I think Ben alluded to this as well earlier, that maybe I'm alone in this, but for me, comedy has less rewatchability than drama. I think I might be the only film critic for whom that is true. Most people say, oh yeah, comedies are infinitely rewatchable, whereas dramas are not. I'm the opposite, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that my emotional response to comedy is in the moment. It's the shock of the joke, and that's what makes me laugh. Whereas drama, I feel like I can get a little bit more in depth with rewatches. So I was a little bit disappointed on this time around. That said, the putting on the Ritz bit was great. It's taking the piss out of 31 Frankenstein. I think is hilarious. I think there's a lot of really good stuff here. I think Marty Feldman steals the show. He is the funniest bit about this movie. Gene Wilder's screaming doesn't always work for me, but when it does, it really does. He's also quite good in this movie. I think some of the Peter Boyle bits work very well. Ben, you talked about his reaction to the putting on the Ritz bit where he gets punched in the face and he has this little reaction. I also think he's hilarious when he gives his final monologue. So, originally, I remember Young Frankenstein as a 4 out of 5. On the rewatch, I have to give it a 3 out of 5, unfortunately. But a lot of that is the strength of the performances and the strength of Mel Brooks. So with that, with my double threes, I'm going to throw it to you, Ben. What do you think?
Wait, can I say one more thing before you talk, Ben?
Go for it.
I just wanted to point out that Gene Hackman used to play tennis with Gene Wilder, and that's why Gene Hackman ended up in the Young Frankenstein film. He said, I really would like to try comedy, and ended up being the blind man in the Young Frankenstein film. And you'll notice there's this weird cut, and if we're going to talk about Noah's weird cuts, there's this weird cut when Gene Hackman says, I was going to make espresso. And then it cuts almost immediately. That's because that was Gene Hackman flying off the cuff. And everyone on set rip-roared into laughter. So they had to cut at a weird point because that's where he nailed that joke. And there was a lot of improv in Young Frankenstein that just really went well. So I don't know, there's something fluid and beautiful about Young Frankenstein for me, and even the drama actors could come into this and be like, bitch, I'm gonna be funnier than all of you, so here it is. And there's something like diva in Gene Hackman's performance, right? So I wanted to throw that out there. Sorry, Ben.
No, you're good. That's hilarious. I think I'm honestly going to be pretty in line with I think everyone else here. So for the 31 Frankenstein, I think the one thing that I haven't really talked about yet that I felt like was a huge theme and a huge idea was this whole nature versus nurture thing. And I do think that was also like really big in the book, except obviously we don't have this sort of contrived scene where you go to a medical college that happens to be having a lecture one day with two very specific jars on a table where you're comparing normal versus abnormal, and you accidentally on purpose sort of end up choosing the abnormal brain. No, I mean, like, the experiment turns out well, and we have this sort of like articulate, rational functioning, fully formed person in this monstrous body. So I think in that one, it's 100% on the nurture side, whereas in the 31 Frankenstein, I mean, it sort of leans a little bit too heavily, I think, on the nature, because we have that thing with the brain. And I think that's a huge disservice. So because of that, like, I really see, once again, like there are some huge sort of problems with the themes that they choose to highlight from the book and how they show those. It's really, honestly, it's a film that's just absolutely ripe for subversion. So, I really do see how this is absolutely iconic. I get that it is a major sort of milestone in horror film and science fiction. And obviously, like, as Jim has said, I 100% agree that Karloff is really just sort of like the shining point of this entire film. Like, his performance is amazing. Everyone else is fine. The ending is pretty weak, I think. Like, thematically, I don't appreciate the whole, like, the kind of like the anti-science thing. And honestly, like, the most interesting thing about it really is just like that sort of like that search for meaning and, the influences around us that make us who we are. But I really do think that, honestly, if you sort of extrapolate from that, you can kind of get the idea that, if you drop this sort of, no, it's because you have an abnormal brain and that's why you're bad and you sort of like deserve to be treated like this and you're genuinely a monster. it's not so much that as I think if we really sort of changed that film to be more like the book, we would have a really cool story where everyone around us, that the act of creation almost becomes sort of like iterative and recursive, and we're sort of like always helping each other create ourselves every day. You know what I mean? Like there's this really interesting thing where we could really get in there where, it's not a reaching out to divinity, and we're not sort of like receiving fire and light and knowledge from the gods. It's that it exists within us already, and we have the power to change each other and influence each other by just who we are. There's a lot of potential in this story, and I think especially even from the book, like if you get into the themes about moral responsibility and learning how to use the power that we have in the correct way, it has a huge amount of potential. I love the idea in the book. I'm really super disappointed with what they turned that into in the 31 film, although I think it is super interesting for a lot of reasons. But again, absolutely ripe for subversion. And I think not only is Young Frankenstein one of the most hilarious films, but I think like it's one of the earliest comedy films that I remember really enjoying. You know what I mean? I saw this when I was younger, and everything from, yes, like the dance number to, a lot of the jokes that they make about just like language and puns, the Igor thing, of course, the freshly dead brain, where he's like, they have this progression of faces that are, it's like 5 years dead, 1 year dead, 4 months, and then like freshly, and it's him just like there. It's freaking hilarious. Or like whenever we have Inga and Frankenstein like sleeping together for the first time, they do that at the top of the lab where, this contraption that he's made to play God, and like he has the power of God in his hands when he's able to take this energy and this light and bring something to life. He's also using this to go and have sex. You know what I mean? Like what more stereotypically male thing could there be than elevating yourself to the level of a god when you're having sex with a beautiful woman? I don't know, man. Like there's a lot of layers to the comedy here, and just
regenerate life and chill.
Boom. There you go. They're creating life. They are creating life. And even just like to go a little bit farther on the brain thing, like it's like whenever you consider that they turned this university and like this contrivance into literally the Transylvania Brain Depository, like they have, I don't know, whatever. I mean, it's like there are a million different funny things about this movie, but also it does such a good job if you've actually seen the source material of pointing out like the weird little flaws in it and like making the story better, I think, by adding this additional layer of saying, no, we can take responsibility for our creations and the effect that we have on others, and we can take responsibility for the consequences of our actions and make personal sacrifices to make the outcomes of the things that we do better. Like we can take this power of creation, we can take this power of science, we can have that power exists within us, and we can use it to positive effect as long as we're morally responsible agents. I really think like that's the underlying sort of message. If I don't necessarily know if Gene Wilder or Mel Brooks really intended that, but intentionally or not, I think in conjunction with a 31 Frankenstein, it just tells a much better, more complete story. That's really what it is. It's almost like completing the story that we started in 31's Frankenstein. Now, as far as the scores go, again, like a lot of the scoring for me as well for Frankenstein 31 is carried on the back of that absolutely stunning, stellar performance by Karloff. And I think that I'm going to rate it a little bit higher than Jim. I think I'm going to give it a 3.5 because it is absolutely a recommend, but probably just, again, like for more historical. I mean, it's, if you're really interested in the story of Frankenstein, go read the book. Just read Mary Shelley's book. You know what I mean? I think I would recommend that more heavily than the 31 version of Frankenstein, the movie, unless you're like a cinephile, unless you're a person who really loves old movies and like really digging into film history, then absolutely go watch it. Or if you just really like horror and you kind of want to understand where the horror genre evolved from, absolutely go see it. But the story itself has some pitfalls that I think I can't necessarily 100% forgive it for. Young Frankenstein, again, like this is also a little bit problematic from some of the discussion that we've had already. But if it's taken within context and taken with a huge boulder of salt with some of the dated humor, I think, as a foil for the original Frankenstein story and making that story more complete, and just because of the merits of the comedy that really does still work in that film, I want to give that a 4 out of 5. So a little bit higher than the original Frankenstein, but I think both movies are absolutely interesting. the Young Frankenstein version might just be a little bit better.
So there you have it. Mel Brooks wins the day in the adaptation of Mary Shelley's book. Young Frankenstein gets 4.54 and 3, and the 31 Frankenstein gets 4, 3.5, and 3 from us. What did you think? Let us know in the comments below. As always, be nice to each other and us. And join us next week. We are doing Come and See, a 1985 war movie, war horror film. We hope that you will come join us for that. And if you like what we did today, then please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and drop any comments in the comments below. Join us next week again for Come and See. And on Wednesday, we will have a review, or at least I will have a review, a 2-minute review of the newest horror entry that is rocking the box office right now, Ready or Not. So be sure to check back then. Thank you again. Have a good night.